know that we've had endorsement from many CEOs in terms of ideas that are consistent with dynamic capabilities. Hopefully I've got your attention so that you'll drill a little deeper with me as we talk about the elements of dynamic capabilities. So the first element, well let me just lay out the three key, if you will, bundles of elements that are critical to dynamic capabilities framework. The first one is what I call sensing and sense making. Companies have to be good at this. This is, figuring out the future, identifying opportunities and threats at home and abroad, figuring this out ahead of the competition. The next bundle of ideas and concepts is around seizing or execution. Is how do you mobilize resources to deliver value and shape markets? You know the story of Xerox with Xerox PARC. They figured out the future of the personal computer industry, but they failed to execute on it. So getting the seizing part right is important. It's such a pity to figure it all out like Xerox did. They did a great job at sensing, but failed to execute. And then, of course, if you're successful, you got to be in the business of transforming, of constantly changing, constantly renewing. And sometimes it's major transformation, sometimes it's minor transformation. So I'm going to organize the concepts that I think are relevant under these three categories: sensing and sense making, seizing, and transforming. Let me turn first to seizing. One simple way to think about this is the way Jack Welch does, which is it's about seeing around corners. I mean, clearly we can't see around corners, but the idea is well taken, namely that you've got to feel what's happening. It's not necessarily by reading what's in some market forecast, but it's about putting things together and figuring out what's really happened. And as Kenneth Boulding, who's a systems theorist, pointed out, the future is bound to surprise us, but we don't have to be dumbfounded. In other words, we've got to be engaging in scenario planning and things of that kind, so we're not dumbfounded when those black swans appear. So it's not about prediction, it's not about forecasting, it's about sensing and sense making. And too many people think it's about forecasting, but it's not. Now, there's even a role for intuition. As Einstein himself pointed out when asked about how did he come up with the theory of relativity, he said intellect has little to do on the road to discovery. There comes a leap of consciousness, call it intuition or what you will, and the solution comes to you and you don't know how or why. So intuition matters here. All of this is saying there's lots of resources you need to tap into in your own psyche and in the psyche of others and in the knowledge of others to figure out the future. And it's not going to come from a mathematical model. And I would argue it's not even going to come from big data. You'll certainly get clues from big data and from smart algorithms, but you won't get a perfectly painted view of the future you're going to face. Now, search activities are important. Monitoring not only the ecosystem you're in, but monitoring beyond the periphery of the ecosystem that you're in matters. Scenario planning, as I said, helps. You got to be probing the future, and you've got to be not focused inwards, but focused outwards. And of course, internal R&D can be one way to sense the future. You can create the future through new inventions and through doing investments in research and development, or through crowdsourcing for that matter, or tapping into the ideas of customers, as Eric von Hippel at MIT pointed out. So there are many ways in which you can sense what's going on, through partnerships, through scenario planning, through crowdsourcing, and importantly, through investment in R&D in promising areas of future growth. The challenge, in essence, is develop some kind of a valid hypothesis and test it in some kind of informal way. There's no formal testing of hypotheses in most business decisions, but there's informal testing and probing and learning. Learning is the key thing that integrates all of these issues. So to move on, let's think about some examples. Let's think about Starbucks. Who could have forecast that there would be room for a coffee house on every block? I certainly didn't and was surprised by it. But the founders at Starbucks sensed that there was room for a European-style coffee house in America, so long as it was made standardized and fast and good. And so we got that European-style coffee house all over America and then all over the world, and including back into Europe itself. So that required some foresight by the founders. Think of Freddie Laker in Laker Airways. That was really the world's first discounted airliner on an international scale. Sadly, that failed, but Laker was the one that figured out that there was an alternative model and a set of demands for low-cost international travel. And he, in the end, faced significant competition. The courts finally determined that it was predatory competition from the major airlines who just dropped their prices to drive him out of business. So he may have won some victories in an antitrust case, but he lost the airline. And then Southwest with a very different model, throwing the hub and spoke model to the wind and creating a different model, a standardized model. There's new ways to invent new business models, even in well-established industries. Or think of the Chrysler minivan, created a whole new category of vehicle, and that was Iacocca who really made that happen. And then Uber and Lyft, and these of course are enabled very much by developments in wireless technology. It's sensing that wireless technology and the growth of the internet would allow a mobile app, and then getting ready to deliver on it, sensing and seizing at the same time, led to great companies like Uber and Lyft. So that's the essence of sensing. It's not about hiring a forecaster. It's about good intuition and staying close to markets and understanding customer needs in a very fundamental way. So here we have a little bit more detail on this. If you want to be a bit more formalistic about it, think of sensing activities as the firm's antenna. And the question is, what do you do with all those signals that come through the antenna? You amplify weak signals into data streams that are collated for diagnosing, interpreting, and creating a variety of scenarios. Now, a lot of people can look at the same data streams and draw a different meaning from it. You know the story of the radar station on Diamond Head that detected something, flying objects at the time of the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor, but it was dismissed as being birds or something like that because it didn't fit the hypothesis. It wasn't believed possible that the Japanese could launch an air attack on Honolulu. So you have to be willing to throw your established hypotheses out the window and listen to the data and tease meaning out of it, and that's what sense making is all about. There is a kind of logic that we call abductive reasoning that may be relevant here. And abductive reasoning is not deductive, it's not inductive, it's just sort of a hybrid form of reasoning that uses logical leaps of the mind and uses available data in a search for patterns. And you can think of that as being good sensing. It's using abductive reasoning, and it's building hypotheses one after the other after the other. In science, and at least in the classroom, we're always given a hypothesis, a research hypothesis, and a null hypothesis, and not much attention is really put to how do you develop those hypotheses. And that's kind of what executives need to do and when they're trying to understand the environment around them. They've got to formulate hypotheses, not formally, but informally, and test them. Test them by talking to customers, test them by talking to employees, test them by talking appropriately to competitors, test them by talking to regulators, test them by talking to people in the media, testing by talking to everybody, and picking up these faint signals and making sense, as Steve Jobs did, of what the future may lie, or what the future may portend. So, if you want to be a bit more formalistic about it, you can break it down into these 4 steps of sensing, sense-making, and then scenario narratives for people to really understand and engage in good sense-making. And you've got to turn it into a narrative, and then you test these narratives one against the other. This is very informal, but I think it's a useful way to think about how you create hypotheses in a business environment and how you test them. They don't become real until they're in the form of scenarios. Now, the logical implications of all of this is that with deductive reasoning, you end up digging deeper and you end up creating new knowledge. It's not just deductive, it's not just inductive, because inductive does not allow new options, and it tends to follow an established template. So we don't always follow established templates, and for those that are interested, inductive reasoning is perhaps one way to characterize the kind of process you need to go through in order to engage in good sense making. Now, I pointed out earlier that it's no good to get the sensing part right if you fail to seize. The classic, iconic example of a failure in this regard is Xerox PARC. PARC stands for the Palo Alto Research Center. All the elements of the PC, from the mouse through to the laser printer, through to the GUI interface, they all came out of PARC in the 1970s, and Xerox had invested considerable resources in building computer science capabilities in this research facility, but it failed to pay attention to what was really going on there. When I say it, the leadership team really got distracted by mergers and acquisitions, and when it came to appropriating large amounts of resources to commercialize these inventions into the personal computer, Xerox really failed to move. The technology leaked out the back door, basically to Apple and others, so it wasn't lost. It ended up diffusing through Silicon Valley, but Xerox belatedly did make some investments around a personal computer, but it failed in the marketplace because it was too little, too late. Now, there's examples of good seizing. Boeing wasn't truly the pioneer in civilian jet aircraft, but it ended up being the winner. It was de Havilland, the British company, that came up with a Comet. But sadly, there was a safety issue with the de Havilland Comet associated with the planes not being built right for high altitude and the stresses of fast jet flight. So Boeing learned from the mistakes of de Havilland and borrowed a lot of technology from the outside, and ended up being the leader with the 707. And then Lockheed and McDonnell, or McDonnell and Lockheed followed with their planes. But Boeing was not the first. It was not really the pioneer, but it ended up with a commanding position in the market. And likewise with IBM. IBM was not the leader in mainframe computing at all. I mean, there were companies like Sperry Univac, GE, Westinghouse that were far away ahead of IBM. But IBM was almost last in terms of being a pioneer in the technology. But Mr. Watson, the founder of IBM, was willing to bet the company on developing the IBM 360 system and making it business friendly. So seizing and getting the timing right is very important. And Alfred Chandler actually points this out in his History of American Business. The companies that succeeded weren't just the ones that invented, they're the ones that invested behind those inventions, because often the creative part is actually not where the big dollars are, whether you're talking drug development or whether you're talking electronics. The R&D is relatively inexpensive. It's going through to commercialization where big dollars have to be spent. And some companies pause when they shouldn't, and of course others race ahead when they should pause. But getting this right is an important part of the equation. And often it's not just about R&D. It can be as simple as creating a platform or a business model. Take the case of Dell Computer. The invention was a business model, and reconfiguring the architecture of revenues and profits in the industry. So seizing is often about designing the right business model and implementing the right business model. And if that involves changing the boundaries of the firm, you do so. So that's some of the elements of seizing. And also understanding the role of complementarities. Increasingly today, complements matter. And it's not the old-fashioned forms of complements like marketing and distribution was always a complement to, say, the PC business. But today there's complementary technologies that have to be combined to make things really work together and useful together. So figuring out what things need to be done inside and what things can be done outside is very important. So we talked earlier about Elon Musk with SpaceX. He decided that he needed to vertically integrate SpaceX because the existing rocketry and existing systems that had been used in the U.S. By the military and by NASA were not fit for purpose. They were all too much gold plating for the low-cost launch vehicles that he needed. So sometimes you've got to do it all over again, and you can't just outsource to whoever may be the existing suppliers. And then, of course, there's this co-alignment and asset orchestration. You know, it's not just figuring out what the right complements are, it's bringing them together the right way. I mean, take the Apple iPod. Really at one level, it's just an MP3 player. But what Steve Jobs did was figured out that we needed digital rights management software. That if you were going to use an MP3 player to provide music, you had to get the recording companies to be willing to provide their music and their content. That required digital music encoding or digital rights management. So figuring out what the key elements are. You needed a mini hard drive in order to create enough storage, pulling them together, and then the App Store on top of it. So figuring all this out may not seem like rocket science now, but I can assure you back then it was all highly innovative, and without those insights, the execution would not have worked. And once again, we get back to Tim Cook's quote about building capabilities and the integration of hardware, software, and services. That's what makes Apple a great company. It's not the inventions per se. It's not the iPod, not the iPad per se. It's what lies behind it. The capabilities of Apple are not in the products, but it's in its ability to integrate and make things very user-friendly and relatively cost-effective. So, good decision-making and execution, in summary, requires managers to be prudent, to create mechanisms to prevent management decision biases, and to possess strategic investment skills. It's not the same thing as financial investment skills, and that's something that's worthy of further mention. You need to bring a strategic logic, not a financial logic. Financial logic, will tell you that the right things to diversify into are things that are not correlated with what you're doing, whereas a strategic logic will suggest that positive correlation is necessary. It's a strategic logic that builds strong dynamic capabilities. So, dynamic capabilities, in the end, involve big, bold, brassy bets. You've also got to be a bit of a risk plunger, but in a measured way, in order to have strong dynamic capabilities. And that's what you see with great companies. Let's now turn to transformation. That's really the hard part, particularly if you're a successful company. It's easy to transform if you're not particularly successful. But if you're successful, you tend to think that you got it right, and you're more reluctant to change than you should be. In addition, successful companies accumulate assets and design rules and decision procedures that make it hard to change. And that leads to what some people refer to as core rigidities, or the iron cage. So companies get stuck in an iron cage that they create for themselves, because that iron cage is often necessary for efficiency. So once again, efficiency pops up as the enemy here. You set certain rules because it's efficient to do so, but then those rules become barriers to change. You know, one can think of the locomotive industry, the steam locomotive industry in the 40s and 50s, which was dominant in the United States and around the world. But there was something on the horizon called the diesel electric. And the steam locomotive titans and the CEOs are on record making statements that steam is going to be dominant for over 100 years. And clearly they were wrong. And they could have changed. They could have changed, although one can say that a lot of their capabilities were not particularly relevant. The only thing electrical in a steam engine was the generator that powered the headlight and the carriage lights. So new technology would have been required. But at the same time, the existing locomotive companies understood how to build a chassis and how to keep a train on the tracks at high speeds. So there were capabilities that were relevant. And they could have augmented their capabilities in transition, but they were too comfortable and they did not read the tea leaves right about the role of the diesel electric. So they failed. Think of the encyclopedia business and Encyclopedia Britannica, a well-known brand that failed to recognize the threat of the online encyclopedia. They went bankrupt. I think they're back in business on an online basis, but not before going through bankruptcy. It was a failure to jump in early. They had the content. If they'd moved faster, they could well have been dominant today, although it would be hard compared to their traditional model of selling. So business transformation, as easy as it may sound, is actually very hard. And few firms get it right. Why is it hard? Well, repurposing an organization is often harder than building a new one. A new company, is used to a fair amount of chaos, and there aren't, set procedures for doing things. There's less organizational apparatus in the way. But as organizations grow larger, there's a great tendency to put in more process and to put in more rules. So to keep yourself fit for transformation, don't put in too many rules as you grow. Netflix is very self-conscious about this. They don't create a rule unless they really, really have to. And it's a discipline that must be followed if you're going to succeed. The difficulty of transformation, of course, is also a function of how much transformation is needed. Think about the auto industry today moving to autonomous cars. Really, the skill set and engineering skill set of the existing industry is all around hardware and around mechanical engineering. But the skill sets required in the future are skill sets around software and computer science. So there's this long technological distance that has to be traveled. The business models of the future are likely to be different. It may not be individuals owning cars. It could be a complete lease model. It could be a power by the hour type model. Business models are going to change as well. And the market distance is likely to be quite high as well. So the auto industry is facing change on many dimensions. And that makes transformation hard. If you have to change on just one dimension, say a market dimension or business model dimension or technological dimension, maybe that's manageable. But when all three happen together, then it's really, really hard. And I would predict that most of the larger OEMs are not going to succeed. They may succeed in some kind of supplier role, but that's about it. Now, what can you do about this besides being able to, have strong leadership? I think companies also need good governance. What do I mean by that? There needs to be alignment between managers and shareholders, but also boards of directors need to be alert. Sometimes when management isn't alert, there's a safety valve built into corporate structure, which is the board of directors. And the board of directors should be asking hard questions. But were they, in the case of Nokia, asking hard questions when the iPhone showed up? Was the board at Kodak asking hard questions when the digital film revolution came along? And the evidence would suggest that they were not. So how do you manage this? Well, the smaller you are, the more nimble you're likely to be. So decentralization is often an assistance. It's usually easy to change if the organizational unit is smaller, and if you have the authority and the mandate to change. So decentralization helps, and good governance helps. And good governance is about populating boards not with representative individuals in any meaningful sense, but with people who are truly knowledgeable about the business and about the constituencies for sure, but really helpful in alerting the board, or the management, should I say, to the strategic challenges that they have to face. I think too many boards are set up with an audit type role, whereas in fact it's a strategic audit, if any type of audit that's really needed. Too much attention to finance, too little attention to strategy. So some companies, on the other hand, have done fantastic at transforming, and a Chinese company called Haier is one such example. Haier has gone from nothing to the world's largest white goods company today. By white goods, I mean refrigerators and freezers and air conditioners and things like that. And there are multiple phases of this transformation that have been followed. There's a process called Rendan Huiyi that Chairman Zhang has created. And when you dig deep into this Rendan Huiyi concept, it's very much like dynamic capabilities. And it's enabled the company to transform and to keep an entrepreneurial culture, and decentralization is an important component of that. Staying close to the company, staying close to the customer, and decentralizing and giving a lot of autonomy to individual business units has enabled transformation to proceed more fluidly than might otherwise have been the case. So look at the Rendan Huiyi model as it's operating at Haier today. And look at Southwest Airlines. There's been a corporate culture there which has assisted transformation. Leadership has continued to communicate the company's goals and values and possibilities, and so folks are much more flexible, they're loyal to the company, they're willing to change as the environment requires it. So corporate culture and also good relationships with complementers and suppliers assists in transformation. Leadership of the company is very important. You have to show the new direction, and then not just entice people to get on board, but get them enthusiastic about being on board as the company moves in new and different directions. As I said before, the automobile industry faces massive challenges today, and I would be very surprised if more than a few of them come through. They certainly won't come through in their current form. But General Motors is making significant investments in autonomous vehicles, and I think those companies that are building strength in integration and in software will be the winners. So we could well see an Apple car in the future. We could well see a Google car in the future, but it could be assembled by General Motors or by the Ford Motor Company or by Hyundai. But I think a model not unlike the Apple Foxconn model is a reasonable possibility. At the end of the day, it's who can innovate and who can integrate and who can transform. These are all key elements of dynamic capabilities. They're going to determine who the winners are and who the losers are. As I've indicated, dynamic capabilities is about keeping that entrepreneurial spirit alive. Making sure that companies don't become lethargic, making sure they don't become bureaucratic, making sure they don't lose a sense of urgency, not stupid urgency, not running around like, making decisions in an unthoughtful way, but being willing to make decisions rather than waiting for the last drop of information to resolve uncertainty. That's not the way to succeed. So there's a big literature today on agility, and you might say, well, isn't dynamic capabilities just about agility? And to which I'll respond, no. Agility is too much about adaptation, and dynamic capabilities is not just about adaptation. It's about changing the environment, not just about responding to the environment. And that's the essence of entrepreneurship. The essence of entrepreneurship is that you don't accept the environment as it is. You change the environment, you respond to the environment, but you also change and modify it as required, and redeploy assets as necessary. So it's not just about agility, it's not just about being fleet of foot. You have to know, you also have to have a strategy, because being fleet of foot without knowing which way to go won't get you to long-term competitive advantage. It won't bring you evolutionary fitness. So decentralization, as I've said several times, can really facilitate dynamic capabilities, and we have what we call the multi-divisional form, or the M-form organization, which has been around for quite a while. And people such as Hire Company, I mentioned before, and W.L. Gore in Delaware, in Wilmington, Delaware, have been very good at extending this structure and driving decentralization. But of course, decentralization has its shortcomings too, because if integration is important, decentralization is sometimes the enemy of integration. So the game here is to decentralize, but also keep enough flexibility so you can integrate, and keep a strong central research and development organization to keep fueling new ideas into the organization. Which leads us to what I call the fundamental transformation conundrum. How do you change the organization's DNA to respond to multiple paradigm shift in an industry? You can change from within, and you can change from without. And fundamental transformation involves doing both. And in fact, the lean startup methodology that some of you may have heard has elements of this within it. With lean startup, it's about learning and changing and pivoting. The problem is that if you're a large organization, it's very hard to pivot, or should I say it's very expensive to pivot. If you're a small organization and you don't have much in the way of fixed assets, pivoting every 10 days or every day is certainly on the cards. But if you're Boeing and you're building the Dreamliner, you've got to have the plan more or less right when you start, because to redesign the Dreamliner while you're building the Dreamliner is going to involve enormous cost overruns. So the nature of the business matters for bringing about change, and some organizational structures will work better in some contexts than in others. So let me leave it there before I come back to the theme that I just mentioned, which is building strategy into the capabilities framework.